All right, what's going on, guys? It's NJ Gloiper. We're back, and we're reading Sources of Power by Gary Klein. I'm putting the figures in the Jumbotron right now. I just had to take photos of all those, post them, and now they're going up on the billboard. So let me get those up there, and then we'll get started. Chapter 5. I think this chapter is on mental simulation. I could be wrong, but let me get those up there. Let me see. There's six. There's 6 figures. All right, give me 1 sec. There's 1, 2. Here's 3. Okay. All 6 figures in the jumbo for your viewing pleasure. Okay, yeah, chapter 5, the power of mental simulation. Okay. All right, let's see. Let's get started. During a visit to the National Fire Academy, we met with one of the senior developers of training programs. In the middle of the meeting, the man stood up, walked over to the door, and closed it. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, "To be a good fireground commander, you need to have a rich fantasy life." He was referring to the ability to use the imagination to imagine how the fire got started, how it was going to continue spreading, or what would happen using a new procedure. A commander who cannot imagine these things is in trouble. Why did the developer close the door before he revealed this ability? Because the idea of using a fantasy as a source of power is as embarrassing as the idea of using intuition as a source of power. Yeah, earlier in I think it was either the last chapter or the one before it, they asked a bunch of experts to name some non-factual or non-logical sources of reasoning or sources of knowledge, or like ways to analyze things, like tools of analysis. And they came up with like eeny, meeny, miny, mo. They said intuition, but they didn't know how to describe it. They didn't have a good vocabulary for it. So even if you learn nothing else from this book, hopefully the vocabulary helps. He was using the term fantasy to refer to the heuristic strategy that decision researchers call mental simulation. That is, the ability to imagine people and objects consciously and to transform those people and objects through several transitions, finally picturing them in a different way than at the start. So it sounds like cause and effect. You're like doing if-thens in your head. This process is not just building a static snapshot. Rather, it is building a sequence of snapshots to play out and to observe what occurs. Here's a simple exercise that calls for mental simulation. Figure 5.1, which is the first post in the Jumbotron. It's paired with 5.2, by the way. Figure 5.1 shows 2 pictures, a truck on the ground, the initial state, and a truck in the air supported by a column of concrete bricks, the target state. Can you think of a way that you, working alone, can get that truck up in the air on a column of blocks? You need to do this all by yourself using an inexhaustible pile of concrete blocks and a jack. So you have like unlimited blocks and a jack. The only machine you are permitted. So one guy, unlimited concrete blocks and a jack. One way to imagine the task is shown in figure 5.2. You begin with the initial state. Then you jack up the right rear tire, slip a set of blocks underneath that tire, remove the jack, and use it on the left rear tire. You repeat the process until all of the tires have been raised. You build a pile of blocks underneath the center of the truck, and then you carefully remove all the blocks supporting each tire so that you wind up with the target state. And again, this is he's talking about mental simulation. He's starting off with the most simple thing. He's telling you like step by step what would happen. So I'm sure it's going to get more complex. There might even be recursion or something. But he's just showing you step by step how you could do something and imagine it. This isn't real. This is an imagined scenario, obviously. This is an action sequence because you are changing from one state to another, bridging the gap between the initial state and the target state. Some people do this with visual imagery, perhaps what is shown in figure 5.2, and others claim that they figure it out logically without ever using visual images. So we're here at example 5.1, the car rescue. And I think these are the best parts of the book, the stories. You get to form your own opinion in a way, which is nice. Of course, the author's going to talk about it later and analyze it his own way, but you get to come up with your own conclusions first, which is nice. I think it's cool. It reminds me a lot of a textbook. So it's stupid to say textbooks are fun, but when they leave it up to the reader to decide how to tackle a problem, that's when it actually is fun. So example 5.1, the car rescue. The leader of the emergency rescue team is called out to save a person who crashed his car into a concrete pillar supporting an overpass. Other firefighters are already on the scene when he arrives, and they are bringing out the jaws of life, a hydraulic machine that can be inserted into a narrow place to exert great force that widens the opening. It's designed to force open things like car doors that have become crumpled in an accident, trapping the victim. The head of the rescue team goes over to the car to investigate. The driver is the only person in the car, and he's unconscious. The commander walks around the car to test each door, but each is badly damaged and won't open. Using the jaws of life to pry open the doors will be difficult. During his investigation, the commanders noticed that the impact has severed most of the posts holding up the roof of the car. He begins to wonder if they can lift off the roof and then slide the passenger out rather than fighting their way through the doors. Then he visualizes how they will slide the driver, where rescue workers will stand to support the driver's neck, how they will turn the driver to maneuver around the steering column, how they will lift him out. It seems to work. He runs through the sequence again to try to identify any problems, but can't find any. He had heard the rescues could be made this way, but he had never seen it. So novel, that's like a novel imagination, like visual interpretation of someone else's story. So that's a powerful tool. Someone tells you something and then you visualize it, you imagine it. It's like reading a book and then coming up with the movie on your own. The first guy to make the Dune movie, so there was no movie before it, so someone had to come up with the world themselves, the visual world. So the imagination is a powerful tool, and it's powerful in multiple ways. It's not just powerful for saving people from car accidents, but for making millions of dollars with box office hits. So it's a powerful tool. Don't discount it, even though scientists will tell you you have to be 100% logical all the time. He explains to his crew what they need to do, and the rescue works out as he had imagined. The only problem is that the driver's legs become wedged underneath the steering wheel, and additional firefighters have to reach in to unlock his knees. So one minor hiccup, but his plan still worked out. The car rescue is an example of a mental simulation that worked out well. The earlier example of the harness rescue showed a case where the mental simulation was incomplete. It neglected the fact that the ladder belt could not be pulled tightly enough. Mental simulation does not always work, as the next example shows. The Libyan airliner, example 5.2. And I can already see it on the next page. There's a header, there's a heading called the Israeli perspective. So this must be between Libya and Israel. It's almost 2 p.m., February 21st, 1973, and a Libyan airliner that took off from Benghazi Airport is heading towards its destination, Cairo. At least that is what its crew believes. In fact, the plane is just passing over Port Taufiq. I don't know how to say that word. Touafic, at the southern end of the Suez Canal. It's about to cross over the Sinai Peninsula, occupied by Israel at that time. The plane is seriously off course. Israeli radar has spotted the plane. The IDF are on alert because of warnings of a terrorist attack. A plan, it is said, to hijack an airplane and explode it over a populated area. Possible targets include the city of Tel Aviv, the nuclear installation at Dimona, and other civilian or military targets. The Israelis note that this airplane is deviating from the typical air corridors and violating Egyptian airspace. It's flown above the most sensitive spots of the Egyptian war zone, yet no Egyptian MiGs are being scrambled to investigate. No Egyptian ground-to-air missiles are fired, although the Egyptians are supposed to be on full alert. The Egyptian communications do not refer to the intruding plane. The Israelis know that the Egyptians have a very sensitive early warning system. A month earlier, they had shot down an Ethiopian plane that had flown over an Egyptian war zone by mistake. So, at 1:54 p.m., the aircraft penetrates into the Israeli war zone in the Sinai Desert, cruising at 20,000 feet. The plane's flying a route referred to by the Israelis as hostile, one used by Egyptian fighters in their intrusions. At 1:56, 2 minutes later, 2 Israeli F-4 Phantom fighters are sent to investigate. 3 minutes later, at 1:59, the F-4s intercept the plane. They don't see any passengers since all the window shades are down. The F-4 pilots identify the plane as an airliner with Libyan markings. They can see the Libyan crew in the cockpit, and they are certain that the Libyan crew recognizes them by the Shield of King David markings on their planes. I thought he was going to say yellow stars on the planes. One of the F-4 pilots reports that the airplane's co-pilot looked directly into his eyes. Sus. Using the international practice of signaling by radio and rocking their wings, the F-4s signaled for the airliner to land at Rephidim Air Base. The intercepted plane is supposed to respond by following the instructions, notifying the appropriate air traffic services unit, and establishing radio communications with the interceptor. The Libyan airplane performs none of these actions. The aircrew does not seem to convey by hand signals that they understand the request and intend to obey. Nevertheless, the airliner continues to head northeast. At 2:01 p.m., so this is 2 minutes later, after trying communication first, the F-4s fire some tracer shells in front of the airliner's nose. The airliner turns toward Rephidim Air Base and descends to 5,000 feet. The pilot lowers the landing gear. Suddenly, he turns back toward the west and increases altitude, as if he's trying to escape. The F-4s fire warning shots in front of him, but he continues. The Israeli generals monitoring the situation decide that the airplane is indeed on a terrorist mission, and they are determined to prevent its escape. They direct the F-4s to force it to land. At 2:08 p.m., just 7 minutes later, the F-4s shoot at the airliner's wingtips. Even after its right wing tip is hit, the airliner continues west. The F-4s begin firing at the wing bases, and finally the airliner attempts a crash landing. The pilot is almost successful but slides into a sand dune. Of more than 100 passengers and crew, only one person survives. So this is the Israeli perspective. So I guess we just heard the neutral perspective. So let's read it from the Israeli perspective. They thought it was a terrorist attack. They thought this plane was going to crash into some military base or something. But let's find out what the what these people think. The airliner is not in direct communication with Cairo Airport. It receives no attention as it flies over sensitive Egyptian locations, and for these other reasons, it's identified as a hostile intrusion. The Israelis try to imagine how they can be dealing with a legitimate civilian airliner. A captain responsible for the safety of passengers avoids even the slightest risk. That is why pilots obey hijackers so quickly. Given this mindset, Any legitimate crew would land when clear signals are given. Yeah, but what if the hijacker tells you not to obey the signals? What if he's just holding a gun to your head? This plane does not land. Here's what Israeli Air Force General Motti, M-O-T-T-I, Had said. So it's General M-O-T-T-I-H-O-D. The captain sees our Israeli insignia on our F-4s. He sees Rephidim airfield ahead. He knows we want him to land, since he lowers his landing gear. Then he retracts the landing gear and flies off. At first, he doesn't fly directly west, but turns to circle the airbase. We interpret this as an attempt to make a better approach. Then he turns and starts to fly west. That is when we order our F-4s to start firing tracer bullets, which the crew must see. Still, they keep going west. No genuine civilian captain would behave in such a manner. In contrast, a crew on a terrorist mission would show such behavior. Therefore, we must prevent their escape and force them to land. Moreover, recent history just confirmed our beliefs. A few months earlier, an Ethiopian airliner had strayed into the Egyptian ground-to-air missile system and was shot down. An American private airplane also was shot down by missiles above the Delta. Several other planes were fired on when they penetrated areas that maps warned pilots to avoid. Pilots have learned to become familiar with these free fire zones and to stay far away from them. Yet here was a plane flying right through them. The Israelis try to imagine how a civilian airline captain would behave in the ways they were observing. They cannot fit the pieces together. In contrast, they can fit the pieces together if they imagine that the plane is on a terrorist mission. The Israelis' diagnosis of the situation is not very difficult, given the clear-cut nature of the evidence. The airliner perspective. During the afternoon, a sandstorm covers the sky of Egypt. The airliner is on a routine flight. The captain and the flight engineer are French. The co-pilot, Libyan. The black box from the airplane is later recovered and shows that the pilot and flight engineer are conversing in French. The co-pilot is not sufficiently fluent to participate in the discussion. That's that doesn't sound very good. What the hell, man? All the pilots and the pilot and the co-pilot don't speak the same language at the same proficiency. That's crazy. All right, well, that seems like problem number one to me. The captain and flight engineer are drinking wine and do not realize they have deviated more than 70 miles from their planned route. That's also crazy. All right. That's maybe the Israelis have a point. Okay. All right. It's not a USS Liberty attack. Maybe this is like maybe they actually were going crazy. At 1:44 p.m., the captain begins to have his doubts about their course. He talks to the flight engineer, but not the co-pilot, about these doubts. Probably because he can't talk to him. The other guy doesn't speak the same language. He does not report his worries to Cairo airport. Instead, at 1:52, 8 minutes later, he receives permission from Cairo airport to start his descent. So he gets the clear to start coming down. So you might think that he's in the clear. You might think that, well, maybe we should change our course. Maybe we should veer back into our original course. Maybe we've drifted too far off. Maybe we should go back. And then he probably gets the okay, and they're like, whatever, no one knows anything. At 1:56, so 4 minutes later, the captain is still uncertain about his actual position. He tries to receive beacon signals from Cairo airport, and those he receives are contrary to the ones he expects according to his flight plan. Nevertheless, he continues flying as scheduled. Between 1:59 and 2:02 p.m., the crew achieves radio contact with Cairo airport and explains its difficulties in receiving the radio beacon and their inability to receive the Cairo non-directional beacon. Cairo airport believes that they are close and directs them to descend to 4,000 feet. So they were at 20,000 feet. Now they're descending to 4,000, which is not very high. We read in one of the other examples, I think from I think it was chapter 4, it was the last one, returning, I think it was God, I already forget the plane model. Anyways, it was an American plane, and they were returning, and they were flying at 2 to 5,000 feet, somewhere in between there. Usually at 2,000 feet, that was their altitude. So they're at 4,000 feet. That's not very high. When the Israeli Phantoms come up, the crew identifies them as Egyptian fighters. The Libyan co-pilot reports 4 MiGs behind us. The Egyptians fly Soviet MiGs, the Israelis do not. So they report them as MiGs, even though they're Phantoms. I'm pretty sure they're Phantoms. I don't think that this story is like trying to trick us here. So they misidentify the airplanes that are yelling at them to veer back on the course to get out of here. They read them as their own airplanes. That's crazy. So they must be really drunk. These may have been I've skipped a part. 1 second. When the Israeli pilot approaches the airliner and gives hand signals to land, the Libyan co-pilot reports this to his colleagues. The captain and the flight engineer gesticulate angrily about the rudeness of the MiGs. These may have been the hand signals the pilot reported. The Libyan captain and flight engineer continue to speak in French. There are 2 airfields in the Cairo area, Cairo West, an international airport, and Cairo East, a military base. The crew interprets the fighters' actions as warning them that they have overshot Cairo West and are over the military base. The aircrew interprets the fighters as a military escort. When they begin to descend at Rephidim Air Base, they see that it is a military base, so they realize they must be at Cairo East. They decide it would be a mistake to land at Cairo East, so they turn toward Cairo West. So now that's where they start descending and then coming back up to head back to Cairo West, the civilian airport, or whatever, the international airport. It's not the military one. So at 2:09 p.m., which is, it doesn't say, I guess 7 minutes later, the captain reports to Cairo Control, "We are now shot by your fighter. This is unthinkable, since at the time Egypt and Libya were on excellent terms." When they are fired on again, they think the Egyptian fighters are crazy. Why would an Egyptian fighter shoot a Libyan civilian airliner? So they still don't understand the situation. They still haven't figured it out. The fighters were friendly escorts, making sure they did not land in the wrong place. They changed course obediently. They are fired on unexpectedly and are unable to build this into their story. Why would Egyptian fighters be firing on them? They are still trying to figure out this when, just before they crash, the Libyan co-pilot finally identifies the fighters as Israeli planes. The black box does not reveal how they incorporate that fact into their diagnosis of the situation. So I would like to know who is the only person who lived. Maybe it was one of the pilots. Probably not, considering they were crash landing, but that is that might reveal something. But yeah, wow, at the last minute they figure it out. They put the last piece of the puzzle in that makes it all make sense. Too late. So that's the end of the example. What happened here? The Israeli generals ran into a situation that exceeded their wildest fantasies. Similarly, the crew of the airliner was not able to imagine what was happening to them until the very end. In this example, mental simulation is used differently than in the car rescue. In that case, mental simulation was used to imagine how a course of action would be played out into the future. Here, the Israeli generals were using mental simulation to imagine what could have happened in the past to account for the strange goings-on. So that's like assumptions. That's like that's deduction. I guess like any kind of simulation is deduction, but that's just, I don't know, maybe there's a difference between deducing into the past and deducing into the future. We'll see. Mental simulation about the past can be used to explain the present. It can also be used for predicting the future from the present. Beth Crandall and I have been interested in mental simulation for several years because the process seems so central to decision making. Sorry, I just slurred that word, to decision making, and because we keep finding it in expert performance. We found that as early as 1946, Adrian de Groot had studied the mental simulation of chess masters. And this is Adrian de Groot, Groot. Two decision researchers, Kahneman and Tversky, and I'm assuming that's Daniel Kahneman, had written a paper on the simulation heuristic based on laboratory studies. They described how a person might build a simulation to explain how something might happen. Excuse me. If the simulation required too many unlikely events, the person would judge it to be implausible. With funding from the Army Research Institute, Beth and I did an exploratory study on mental simulation to learn more about its nature. Our idea was to gather and examine a set of cases to see if there were any irregularities. For the most part, the cases came from our own records, the harness rescue case, the car rescue, and we also included cases from other sources, such as the Libyan airliner incident, as well as examples from a book by Charles Perrow, Normal Accidents, written in 1984, which gives the detail behind a variety of disasters and breakdowns. In addition, we performed some informal interviews and asked the people in our company to volunteer examples. After we had collected all the cases, we reviewed them for commonalities and differences. Then we tried to code them for features such as time pressure, experience level of the person, use of visual versus non-visual simulations, and so on. We dropped about 20% of the cases because the description did not clearly show how the mental simulation was being used. We could imagine how the person might have been using mental simulation, but when it was a stretch, we weren't sure if we were studying the person's fantasies or our own. That left us with 79 cases. These cases showed the same patterns, Klein and Crandall, 1995. The people were constructing mental simulations almost the way you build a machine. Here is the starting point. Then this kicks in, which changes that, and then this other thing happens, and you wind up there. It's like designing a watch or a mousetrap. For the overpass harness rescue, the fireground commander imagined how they would lower the ladder belt down, then lift the woman up by an inch, slide the belt under her, buckle it, then lift it up. So step by step, just breaking it down into, I guess, parts that cannot be broken down any further, or like it's not useful to. It's not useful to the simulation. So in the spirit of utility, they're just like going step by step and simulating each of these processes. For the car rescue, the commander imagined how they would lift off the roof, climb into the car, support the man's neck, slide him away from the steering column, and grab hold of his arms and legs and swivel him up and out of the car. We noticed something else. The mental simulations were not very elaborate. Each seemed to rely on just a few factors, rarely more than 3. It would be like designing a machine that had only 3 moving parts. Perhaps the limits of our working memory had to be taken into account. Also, there was another regularity. The mental simulation seemed to play out for around 6 different transition states, usually not much more than that. So I'm going to assume here, I'm just going to postulate that there's the working memory problem, but there's also the time pressure problem. We don't have unlimited time to solve decisions. If you did, nothing would ever get done, likely because you'd be pondering the decision before you ever did anything. So yeah, there's time pressure, there's limited memory. There's also there's only so many solutions that you can affect in the real world. So like getting someone out of a car after a car accident, like in reality, there's only so many things you can do. So that also reduces the amount of steps. I mean, unless you want to go crazy, but in the interest of time and saving the person's life, you're not going to come up with a 20-step plan. Even if it was like breaking down the 6-step plan into more steps, like what's the utility in that? So it seems like it's just practical. That's what this is. This is the parts requirement for building a mental simulation, a maximum of 3 moving parts. The design specification is that mental simulation has to do its job in 6 steps. Those are the constraints we work under when we construct mental simulations for solving problems and making decisions. That's pretty bad. If you can only think into the future for like 6 steps to solve one problem, that's not very good. Or at least if this is all mental. He is talking about mental simulations, but if that's your constraint, that is just proof why you should write notes. You should be journaling. You should be writing down your thoughts and writing out your goals and how you're going to achieve them and how you're working towards them. Because if what he's saying is true, the average person can only come up with 6 steps for 3 moving parts. Yeah, that's not very robust. So yeah, this is good information. I mean, like, maybe it's different with cell phones. Maybe people have less attention span or more now. I don't know, but I would assume it's not very far off. We have to assemble the simulation within these constraints. So there are physical and realistic constraints that we are confined by because we live in the real world. Of course, there are ways of avoiding the constraints. If we have a lot of familiar in the area, we can chunk several transitions into one unit. In addition, we can save memory space by treating a sequence of steps as one unit, rather than representing all the steps. We can use our expertise to find the right level of abstraction. There you go. So abstraction and this is for mental simulation. So he's not breaking out the pen and paper. He's not breaking out the calculator. He doesn't have the notepad out. He's literally just telling you, if you're going to do all this mentally, this is what experts do. This is what people with expertise and experience do. They abstract the steps. They take what's useful about a group of steps and abstract it and kind of like make a hierarchy out of these things. And that probably helps when you figure out that like step 1 through 6, like you have to do 6 steps and you realize that there's a giant gap between 1 and 2. Like now you have to fill that in. So yeah, 1 to 2 isn't working, but if you can figure out what goes between the 2, you could have a 7-step plan or an 8-step plan or whatever. Maybe you could do it recursively and just keep abstracting once you find what connects the 2, what the missing link. So, and experts, I assume, are able to do this more quickly, or they are able to do it more reliably without as many failures. For example, in the car rescue, the team leader could count the removal of the car roof as one step without imagining the coordination needed to make sure no one got hurt. If he had included the position where everyone would stand before lifting the roof, how would they step in unison and so forth? The simulation might have bogged down. If he were worried about this particular step, he might do a separate mental simulation for it to satisfy himself that the roof could be quickly disposed of. The more of these side trips he had to take, the more he would need to hold in his mind. Another strategy for overcoming memory limits is to write things down and draw diagrams to keep track of the transitions. If the moving parts interact with each other in each transition, you have to remember a lot more since you have to keep track of the parts themselves at each point. Even diagrams start to fall apart as more and more arrows are drawn to represent interactions. We heard a lot about this from some software programming experts we interviewed. Part of a quality inspection team, they had recently finished inspecting a program with over 900,000 lines of code. That's crazy. So I'm working on some software right now, that I'll just say it's some type of examination software. I'm working on that, and I just reduced it from 3,700 lines of code to 3,000. I got 700 lines of code out by splitting it into different files and refactoring, and that took me all day. That took me all day and like an hour yesterday of planning. So 900,000 lines of code. That is insane. I don't know what software they were working with, but I can tell you that that's very complex. My God. So each person on the team inspected around 5,000 lines of code a day. That is difficult on its own. And this is before AI. Don't forget, they don't have like GitHub Copilot or anything like that to help them. They probably didn't even have Stack Overflow. So that's crazy. No ChatGPT, no. I mean, maybe they had Google, maybe they had Forms, but who would be allowed to? Well, whatever. I'm just speculating now, but whatever. It's still crazy. Okay. The point is that it's insane. 5,000 lines of code a day. They told us that a software program is like a giant machine with many different moving parts, all the variables, and fixed parts, the operators that transform the variables. Since the code was written down, they did not have to remember all the moving parts. The variables were listed in front of them. The inspection was to imagine how the machine was going to work when the program started running. If the program was linear, as in the truck examples in figures 5.1 and 5.2, the job wasn't too hard. If the variables interacted with each other, the job of visualizing the program in action became quite difficult. So this is another challenge in building a mental simulation. We search for a way to keep the transitions flowing smoothly by building a simulation that has as few interactions as possible. Considering all these factors, the job of building a mental simulation no longer seems easy. The person assembling a mental simulation needs to have a lot of familiarity with the task and needs to be able to think at the right level of abstraction. If the simulation is too detailed, it can chew up memory space. And if it's too abstract, it doesn't provide much help. We came across a few cases where people could not assemble a simulation. For instance, the Israeli generals failed to construct a simulation of how a genuine commercial airline pilot would take so many risks. Because of this failure, the generals concluded that the airplane was not a legitimate airliner. Cases like this give us some idea about how experience is needed to build a mental simulation. So I'm just, while I was reading that, I was thinking about an easy way to explain the mental simulation kind of like abstraction thing. When you first learn to drive, you're not an expert. So you have to like figure out how much pressure to put on the gas pedal, how much to turn the wheel, and how much you can turn it at different speeds in different road conditions and in different cars if you have more than one car. So there's like all these confounding variables, and usually they are interacting with each other. Like you may be driving someone else's car in the rain. And visibility might be like, it might be nighttime versus daytime. So there's all these like variables that you have to like account for when you first learn to drive. But eventually, like, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years of driving, you can figure out how, like if someone gives you directions to a place that you've been before, or maybe you haven't been there before, you don't have to plan for, you know, each turn or what are the road conditions today or what car am I using. Eventually that all just disappears. That's like not even considered part of the step of planning anymore. You don't have to simulate that. You can just get in your car and drive to the place, and that's all one step. So that's what he means by abstraction, in case anyone was wondering. And yeah, computer code is like that. When you're writing code let's say you're building out something for the first time, you have to imagine the software completely. There is nothing written yet, so you have to imagine it in its entirety, or at least a part of it. And that's usually how programmers tackle things. They break it down into parts and write functions or routines that tackle each individual part, and then they assemble those later. But that's where it becomes like this like house of cards, and things get unmaintainable. When different people are writing different parts of the program, or one person documents one function really well and then another person doesn't document any of their functions, like assembling that, like putting it together, that might be really difficult. So that's what programming is like. You're constantly problem solving. You're constantly doing mental simulations. We wanted to study how people failed to build a mental simulation. So we tried something else. We asked people to generate mental simulations in front of us. This is how we came to study the Polish economy. The Polish economy received little coverage in the news media when it was reformed, yet it is one of the boldest experiments of our time. I don't know anything about the Polish economy, so I'm learning as much as you are if you haven't heard of it either. In 1989, the Polish government, freed from control by the Soviet Union, realized that socialism was leading it nowhere, so the government made preparations to convert to a market economy. On January 1st, 1990, the new Polish government decreed the switch to capitalism. From that moment, the government would no longer use state companies to provide meaningless jobs. They allowed Zlotys, Zlotys. I have never heard of this. This is before I was born, so I don't know what the hell any of this is. They allowed Zlotys, Zlotys, to be traded on the open market. They let inflation and unemployment run uninhibited. It was a dramatic moment in the retreat from communism. The announcement about Poland switching to a market economy came as we were gathering cases of mental simulation. I realized that I could find some experts and ask them to simulate mentally what was going to happen in Poland during the coming year. Would the reform succeed, or would the Poles have to back down? Fortunately, I was able to interview a bona fide expert, Andrzej, it looks like Andrew, but with a Z-E-J at the end. Pronounced Andre. I should have just read ahead. Pronounced Andre. Bloch, B-L-O-C-H. An associate professor of economics at Antioch University. And I should really be improving and practicing my word chunking. To be fair, it was on the next line, but I should have been able to check that before I read it. He is Polish and received all his education up through his bachelor's in Poland. He got his PhD in the United States. So likely he's like one of these laissez-faire free market economists. He makes regular trips back to Poland. Before I tell you about Andre, think about what you would... wait, hold on. Is this one of those weird sentences? Before I tell you about Andre, think about what you would have if I had interviewed you. Could you have set up a mental simulation for the Polish economy during the year 1990? Could you do it now for the coming year? Where would you start? What could you include in the simulation? Most people shrug their shoulders. If they give any answer at all, it is to parrot back something they have heard on TV. I hear there is more expansion in Eastern Europe these days. All right, for the record, in case he goes through it, I'm just going to say, first you got to figure out what the hell's going on with the banking system, and then you got to figure out what their manufacturers are doing. What kind of trading? Who's their biggest trading partners? Surplus, import, export, that kind of stuff. Ports, what are their ports doing? I know they're landlocked, so it's got to be land ports, but that kind of stuff. I would disregard any of this stuff on paper. I would pretty much anything that's like enshrined in the law, whatever. I wouldn't even look at that. Andre created wonderful simulations. Without prompting, he boiled it down to 3 variables: the rate of inflation, the rate of unemployment, and the rate of foreign exchange. I asked Andre to imagine how the Polish economy would do on these 3 variables by quarter for the year 1990. According to Andre, since the government was not going to fight inflation artificially, the inflation rate was going to zoom up from its then current rate of 80% a year to an annual rate of about 1,000% for a few months. This meant prices would increase around 80% a month instead of 80% a year. Goods were going to become quite expensive. Prices would rise faster than wages. Quickly, people would not be able to afford to buy very much, so demand would fall and the prices would stabilize. He estimated that this would take about 3 months. To put things in perspective for me, he noted that food shortages were the traditional source of unrest in Poland and Russia. People were more likely to protest food shortages than a lack of political freedom. Yeah, one is a material and prescient issue. The other one is like freedom or whatever the hell that is. To sort of, think on that idea real quick. I think it was Voice of America was broadcasting into Russia during the 70s and 80s, and they were telling Russians what to think about the United States. They were saying how great it was to be in the United States, how free we were, how much freedom we have, what the word liberty meant, and they were giving all these like platitudes, like you can do whatever you want, blah blah blah, capitalism, the free market, freedom of speech, whatever the hell that is. These guys are from communist countries. They don't know what that means. They don't know like what is political freedom. Is that even important? They probably had no conceptual like ideation about it. They probably had no idea what those words meant, let alone what it would look like if they had those things. So, yeah, food shortages being more important. Yeah, obviously. If they could not afford to buy bread, that might cause the government to collapse. Nevertheless, he felt that the euphoria over the solidarity movement was high enough and that the period of sharp inflation would be short enough so that there would not be problems on this score. When I reviewed his predictions with him a year later, we found that this was accurate. He had accurately called the sharp increase up to 1,000% for January and February, as well as the downturn to around 20 to 25% by April and thereafter. Next, he considered unemployment. If the government had the courage to drop unproductive industries, many people would lose their jobs. This would start in about 6 months as the government sorted things out. The unemployment would be small by US standards, rising from less than 1% to maybe 10%. For Poland, this increase would be shocking. Politically, it might be more than the government could tolerate and might force it to end the experiment with capitalism. When we reviewed his estimates, we found that unemployment had not risen as quickly as he expected, probably, Andre believed, because the government was not as ruthless as it said it would be in closing unproductive plants. Even worse, if a plant was productive in areas A, B, and C, and was terrible in D and E, then as long as they made a profit, they continued their operations without shutting down areas D and E. So the system faced a built-in resistance to increased unemployment. Finally, he looked at foreign exchange, which he saw as a balancing force. As the exchange rate got worse, increasing from 700 zlotys per dollar to 1,500 zlotys per dollar, people would find foreign goods too expensive, so they would buy more Polish items. Similarly, outsiders would find that Polish-made items were a bargain, so exports would boom, increasing employment and improving economic health. He thought that this might take a few years to accomplish, if at all. He expected that during 1990, the exchange rate would continue to increase, eventually to 1,400 zlotys per dollar. He expected that the government would intervene at that point. During the year, I noted that the zlotys went up to around 900 per dollar and stayed there. Andre had been too pessimistic. In 1991, I discussed this with him, and he felt that the problem again was that the government was softening the blows. Had the full market economy shift had been made as advertised, the rate would have increased much faster, and the shift would have been finished much quicker. This mental simulation depended on three factors and on a few transitions: rapid inflation, reduced level of inflation, gradual rise in unemployment and loss in exchange rate, improved employment, and finally, stabilized exchange rate. Andre was not finished. He estimated the likelihood of success for this market economy experiment at 60%. A virtuoso at simulating Polish futures, he generated pessimistic mental simulations and showed how the experiment could fail. He switched to political simulations. Buoyed by this example, I lined up two more people to interview, neither as expert as Andre. The first was one of Andre's best students who had visited Eastern Europe recently. The other was a professor of political science at another university. This man had spent a sabbatical in Poland many years earlier. Neither of them could generate any mental simulations at all. They considered only two variables: inflation and unemployment. So there was no balancing factor such as foreign exchange. Worse, they did not know the current rate of inflation or unemployment, and they had no sense for what would count as a high rate for either variable. The student thought that there would be tough times, but the experiment would succeed, which made him happy. The professor was a Marxist who thought the Poles were making a big mistake by retreating from the wave of the future. He thought there would be tough times and that the government would have to dismantle the market economy, which made him happy. The implications of this minor sideline in an exploratory study are clear. Without a sufficient amount of expertise and background knowledge or context, it may be difficult or impossible to build a mental simulation. Yeah, so he's talking about the norms, averages, the mean, the minimum, the maximum, the domain of these variables, and you have to know where the variables could wander, or like if they're going to interact with each other, what could be like the worst way they could interact if they interact like destructively, or maybe it's like an upward spiral, maybe it's a vicious cycle or something. You have to be able to expect the worst or the best outcomes for each of the variables. So if you don't know what the variables could do, how could you write a function, or how could you simulate something to expect or to manipulate them, or to make them interact with each other? So if you're not an expert, you probably don't have the right context. So that's one thing the experts have. He's telling you the experts have context. They have years and years of context. And sometimes that can be abstracted. I'm sure that they don't all think back to every year and each of its, going with the Polish economy example, each of Poland's exchange rates, not like from each quarter. You don't have to remember all that. You don't have to remember the unemployment rate at each quarter or anything like that. You can just abstract it to the rate is increasing. It's sort of like integration, where or deriving. It's like you can find the slope of the thing, you can find the rate of change, and that's the thing that you have to remember or incorporate. So sometimes context can be reduced, or I guess simplified into shorter and fewer steps. You have less variables to integrate into your simulation. So these experts are immersed in this data. They have the context. They're swimming in it. It's like a fish in the water they swim in. They don't even realize it. They don't have to think about how to swim. It's just like what they do all the time. You're not thinking about breathing. It's just part of the world around you. You're just doing it all the time. So if you're an expert, it's just in the background. It's just part of the world, and you don't have to bring it into the simulation. It's already built in. Let's see, where was I? The implications of this minor sideline. Did I read that? Yeah. Okay, so the expert, despite his desire to see the market economy experiment work, could imagine different ways for it to fail and to anticipate early warning signs. He told me about several. Example, if the rate of inflation does not come down below an annual rate of 50% by April, start worrying. So he told me about several warning signs. That cut off at a weird spot. So, incidentally, the Polish economy did fairly well during its first year as a market economy. Inflation stayed at a reasonable level. Unemployment did not increase too much, and foreign exchange remained stronger than expected. The experiment seems to be working, and as of this writing, Poland has become the first former communist country to enjoy economic growth. The example of the Polish economy shows how difficult it is to construct a useful mental simulation, but once it is constructed, it is impressive. We do this all the time in areas about which we are knowledgeable. We do it to imagine how a supervisor will react, or how to repair a car, or how to explain the way a neighbor has been behaving. We do it without giving much thought to what an important source of power we have in our ability to construct mental simulations on demand. In technical fields, people may spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, and sometimes over $1 million, to build computer simulations of complex phenomena. The computer is needed to keep track of all the variables and the interactions and all the different pathways that are possible. The programs are not as limited by memory capacity as we are. However, these programs are extremely specialized. They run simulations only in the single area for which they have been programmed. In contrast, you and I carry around a multi-purpose mental simulator that adapts to all kinds of different problems and requires virtually no reprogramming. True, it has a limited memory capacity, but its versatility is astounding. So now he gets into the crazy mental simulations, the models of them. So these are all the figures, except for the last one, in the Jumbotron. I don't know if I'm going to go through these. Some of these are crazy. I feel like I should just leave this to you guys. Maybe I'll read this. So let me see. I'm just going to skim it real quick. In assembling the action sequence, figure 5.3 reminds us that mental simulations generally move through 6 transitions, driven by around 3 causal factors. I always do that. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. Yeah, this is just explaining the examples. I don't really care. Explaining a situation. This might be interesting. For cases where a person was trying to explain what had happened in the past, the reason was either to make sense of a specific event, such as a juror's trying to figure out if the evidence showed that the defendant had committed the crime, or to make sense of a general class of events by deriving a model, such as Einstein's imagining how a beam of light shining through a hole in an elevator might seem to curve if the elevator was moving. Figure 5.4 shows a specific version of the model that describes how we explain a chain of prior events, or a state of the world. So that's kind of interesting. So we have the one where it's I guess it's assembling a general model of mental simulation, and now we have one that explains the past. So we already have the outcome. How do we work backwards? So this set of states and transitions is the action sequence, the mental simulation that explains the rude behavior. I guess that was some part of the last story. The next step is to evaluate the action sequence at a surface level. Is it coherent? Do the steps follow from each other? Does it apply? How complete is it? And blah, blah, blah. Okay. Sometimes the mental simulation will not pass the internal evaluation, and that also helps you make sense of things. Example 5.3 illustrates this with a story reported in a newspaper. The IRA terrorist. A well-respected lawyer has agreed to defend a man accused of committing an act of terrorism, planting a bomb for the IRA. The lawyer, asked why he would take the case, answers that he interviewed the accused man, who was shaking and literally overcome with panic. He was surprised to see the man fall apart like that. He tried to imagine the IRA's recruiting such a person for a dangerous mission and found that he couldn't. He cannot conjure up a scenario in which the IRA would give a terrorism assignment to a man like this, So his conclusion is that the man is innocent. This lawyer could not generate an action sequence that passed his internal evaluation, specifically the requirement that the transition between steps be plausible. His failure to assemble a plausible sequence of steps led him to a different explanation than the prosecutors had formed. That's why you see a long curving arc in figure 5.4. The failure to assemble the mental simulation was the basis of the conclusion. So if there is doubt, there is no doubt that it's wrong. Like, you can be sure that the model is wrong. There are also times when you use mental simulation to try to increase your understanding of situations like these. You're trying to build up better models. When you run the action sequence in your mind, you may notice parts that still seem vague. Maybe you can figure out how to set up a better action sequence, or maybe there are some more details about the present state that you could gather. Going back to the example, and by the way, that sounds like induction. Going back to the example of your coworker, your explanation has not included the fact that you received such a good performance evaluation. So, and by the way, if I had to explain figure 5.4 against 5.5, one of them seems like deduction, one of them seems like induction. So maybe that might be useful. Don't quote me on that. I have to read further ahead, but that's my hypothesis. Going back to the example of your coworker, your explanation has not included the fact that you received such a good performance evaluation. I don't think we read that one. Possibly the coworker felt you had gotten recognition for work that someone else had done. Perhaps you can get a general sense of the situation by talking to your boss. That might give you some more data points for building your explanations. Okay, here we go. Projecting into the future. In many cases, decision makers try to project into the future, either to predict what is going to happen, perhaps to prepare for it. Manufacturers bidding on a new part who try to imagine how they will make the part, how long that will take, or to watch a potential course of action to find out if it has any flaws, the car rescue. Figure 5.5, which is also in the Jumbotron, shows how you can try to build a bridge from your present condition to a future one. You know the initial state, and you are trying to imagine the target state. Sometimes you also have a good picture of the target state, as in the truck example, and your job is to figure out how to convert one into the other. What is new here is the way you run and review the action sequence. Recall the car rescue. The team leader put his plan under a microscope, scrutinizing each step to see if there could be a problem. He was trying to find pitfalls in advance. In the end, he evaluated his plan based on the nature and severity of the problems that he found. Sometimes we form a general impression that a plan is going to work out without putting the plan under a microscope. We recognize aspects of it that match typical cases that worked for us in the past or led to difficulties. So we use intuition to form an emotional reaction of optimism or worry. In his research with chess masters, Adrian de Groot found that they frequently formed these global impressions of whether a line of play was going to work even before they studied the sequence. Once you've evaluated the action sequence, which is usually a planned course of action, so that sounds like System 2 thinking, you may try to modify the plan to overcome the pitfalls, or you may decide it cannot be salvaged, so you reject it, or you may carry it out. In some cases, the purpose of the mental simulation is to make a prediction, how long a process will take, for example. So you run the action sequence through in your mind and form a judgment. Finally, you can use mental simulation to prepare for carrying out a course of action by rehearsing what you are going to do. Let me think. That reminds me of something. Rehearsing what you're going to do. That's right. Some people were interviewed. I forget where I saw this, but it was. I know it wasn't a TED Talk, so I know it's not some goofy stuff like that. But they interviewed a bunch of experts, and one thing they found among the experts was that they were very good at being consistent in visualizing their goals and visualizing how they would step towards them, how, like, what steps they would take and what it would look like after they completed each step, and what they might do wrong or how it might fail or whatever. So they were doing this like rehearsal. They were making sure that like each day they would plot out, how am I going to achieve my goals today, step by step. So it's not this like, it's not this abstract thing like, I need to lose weight, so I'm going to exercise. It's like, okay, I'm going to lose weight. That means today I'm going to leave my shoes out for tomorrow so that when I wake up, I'm ready to go for a run. And it's like very, very concrete and practical things like that. And that was one of the things that experts tend to do very well. They have this self-discipline that they make sure that they're always doing these rehearsals. They're always planning their next move, because it makes you sharper. I do believe that it is like a muscle, the mental simulation thing. It's like becoming an expert. If you're good at making mental simulations about going for a run the next day, or how you're going to plan your meals, why wouldn't that apply to your job? Why wouldn't that apply to your career? Like if you're going to make a computer program and it takes you 2 months to plan it, why wouldn't you be good at planning something for 2 months the next time? Or how would you not get better at it? So something to think about, something to consider about how you carry out your own life, how you live your own life and achieve your goals, and how you seek them, and how you even plan your goals in the first place. We have left the truck in figure 5.2 dangling in the air long enough. The parameter where I left off, but I'm just going to continue reading. There's no point in going through that thought again. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. We've left our truck in figure 5.2 dangling in the air long enough. The parameters are that you know the initial state and the target state. Your job is to transform one into the other. You assemble the action sequence of what is going to change from one state to the next. Then you evaluate the sequence. Does it make sense? If you are simply trying to make up a plausible plan, then you have succeeded. If you're going to carry this plan out, then your evaluation must be a little more careful. You might notice that the truck can roll forward or backward each time you jack it up. Maybe you can use some of the blocks to wedge around the tires. You might also notice that all the weight of the truck in the target state seems to be resting on a single point. Is there any place on the bottom of a truck that can bear such a weight? Perhaps it will be safest to build a very large central platform to spread the weight out more. The mental simulation study that I've been describing was done for purposes of exploration, and so the proposed model has to be considered tentative until we conduct more research. Nevertheless, since completing this exploratory study, we've examined mental simulation more carefully in other research projects, and have not come across anything to contradict the models shown in figures 5.3, 5.4, and 5. Mental simulations run from the past into the present, or the present into the future, can stretch to help us infer a missing cause, a missing effect, or a bridge between the two. But they can also mislead us. How mental simulations can fail. This chapter is very long. If you can't tell, most of the spaces I've done are about an hour. I think this one's going to run to an hour and a half. I'm going to try and get through it. So bear with me. Hang in there. We got like 4 more pages to go. I lied, 5 or 6. All right. So how mental simulations can fail. Let me grab some water real quick. The biggest danger of using mental simulation is that you can imagine any contradictory evidence away. The power of mental simulation can be used against itself. Consider the example of the rude coworker. You believe the rudeness comes from paranoia that you have divulged the coworker's secret. To test this explanation, you ask a mutual friend to ask the coworker the reason for the rude behavior. The friend reports back that your coworker was not aware of any rudeness, harbors no anger towards you, and never thought you might reveal confidential information. Does that stop you? Not for a second. The coworker was not aware of rudeness, but whoever is. Similarly, not feeling any anger at all sounds suspiciously like denial. That makes you even more convinced of your explanation. You don't really believe the claim that the coworker never thought you might divulge a confidence, since everyone who tells a secret must have these worries. More likely, the coworker did not want to appear paranoid in front of the mutual friend and was faking good. Or maybe the mutual friend is not so trustworthy after all. Maybe this so-called mutual friend is not telling you the truth on purpose, to lull you into a trap, perhaps to get you to tell the precious secret. Maybe they are all in on it. We can ask what evidence you would need to give up your explanation. Sadly, the answer is that if you are determined enough, you might never give it up. You can continually save the explanation by making it more comprehensive and complicated. In the 19th century, the British scientist Sir Francis Galton tried an experiment to see if he could experience what it was like to be paranoid. He tried to maintain the belief that everyone he encountered was plotting against him. Two people talking suddenly look up at him. They are part of the plot. A horse in the park shies away when he comes into view. Even the animals are against him. Galton continued this for part of the day, but had to give up the exercise before the day was over. His paranoid explanations were becoming so convincing that they were beginning to get out of control, and he became frightened for his own sanity. Perrow, from 1984, and that's Perrow, has described similar cases that have resulted in major accidents. He refers to them as de minimis explanations, explanations that try to minimize the inconsistency. The operator forms an explanation and then proceeds to explain away disconfirming evidence. So this sounds like confirmation bias. The following example was an incident that took place on the Mississippi River. Figure 5.6 depicts the incident, and that's also in the Jumbotron. Example 5.4, the Trademaster and the Pisces. The plot was simple. A ship in a safe passing situation suddenly turned and was impaled by a cargo ship. To understand how such a thing could occur, remember all the times you have been walking down a hall, approaching someone coming from the other direction. You try to move aside, only to find the other person has moved in the same direction, zigging back at the same time, zigging in unison again. Finally, you both come to a full stop, smiling and resorting to hand signals to sort out the passage. In the case of the Trademaster and Pisces, the momentum did not allow them to stop. The Mississippi is sufficiently well mapped for ships as large as these, 600 feet long, 24,000 and 33,000 tons, to be able to figure out their passing patterns. Even before they see each other, even as they are rounding the final bend, the two captains radio their arrangement to pass starboard to starboard, with their right sides closest. Then the complications start. The captain of the Pisces sees that he is going to be overtaken by a tug and will have to steer too closely to rafts of barges on his left. Therefore, he uses his radio to request a port-to-port passage with the Trademaster, at the same time turning to his right to get in position. Unhappily, the captain of the Trademaster never gets the message. He sees the Pisces swing out and figures that the captain will correct his error soon enough. He doesn't want to turn right, since he expects the Pisces to go in that direction any moment. Instead, he turns further left himself to give the Pisces more room to shift back. The Pisces, wondering why the trademaster was swerving out so far, turned even more sharply to give the trademaster more room. That is how they collided. Yeah, they both turned in the same direction. This simple case shows how disconfirming evidence is explained away. A ship that should be staying to your right swings over to your left. No problem, you've seen it before. There's no reason to think anything might be wrong until it's too late. Scientists also fall prey to de minimis explanations. The following example shows how easy it is to invent an explanation that discounts some inconvenient observations. Example 5.5, the disoriented physicists. Two physicists associated with the Aspen Center for Physics are climbing in the Maroon Bells Wilderness near Aspen, Colorado. While descending, they lose their bearings and come down on the south side of the mountain instead of the north side near Aspen. They look below them and see what they identify as Crater Lake, which they would have spotted from the trail heading home. One of them remarks that there is a dock on the lake. Crater Lake does not have a dock. The other physicist replies, "They must have built it since we left this morning." A couple of days later, they reach home. That's pretty crazy. I do not count it as a weakness of mental simulations that they are sometimes wrong. My estimate is that most of the time they are fairly accurate. Besides, they are a means of generating explanations, not for generating proofs. That's an important distinction. Explanations are not proofs. And I think one of the key distinctions is that explanations might work for a single simulation, whereas proofs work for all simulations, or I guess you could even say like any variation. So an explanation might work out by accident, or it might not work by accident, or by like any of those possibilities where it's only useful in the single circumstance. To generalize or to abstract it or to provide something more bulletproof, more robust, you probably want to sit down and think about it with a pen and pad instead of doing a mental simulation. I do count it as a weakness of mental simulations that we become too confident in the ones we construct. One reason for problems such as de minimis explanations that discard disconfirming evidence is that once we have built a mental simulation, we tend to fall in love with it. Whether we use it as an explanation for our prediction, use it as an explanation or for prediction, once it is completed, we may give it more credibility than it deserves, especially if we are not highly experienced in the area and do not have a good sense of typicality. This overconfidence effect has been shown in the laboratory by Hurt and Sherman. In 1985, they asked subjects to generate cartoon sequences for the Big Penn State versus University of Pittsburgh football game. The subjects were then asked to rate their confidence in one of these teams actually winning the game. The result was that the confidence rating was affected by the cartoon sequence. Subjects who imagined a sequence in which Penn State won the game rated Penn State's actual chance as higher than the subjects who imagined a sequence where the University of Pittsburgh won the game. Mental simulation takes effort. Using it is different from looking at a situation and knowing what is happening. Mental simulation is needed when you are not sure what is happening, so you have to puzzle it out. When you're pressed for time, you may not do as careful a job in building or inspecting the mental simulations you've constructed. The shortcoming, however, does not argue for any other approach. If you want to deduce every inference logically, you will still run into time barriers. A final shortcoming is that we have trouble constructing mental simulations when the pieces of the puzzle get too complicated. There are too many parts, and these parts interact with each other. If we're trying to repair a piece of equipment and keep testing it to find out what is wrong, we have a lot of trouble if more than one thing is broken. Once we find one fault, we may be tempted to attribute all the symptoms to it and miss the other fault. So we fix just the problem we know about, and the result is that the equipment still doesn't work. Despite these limitations, mental simulation allows us to make decisions skillfully and solve problems under conditions where traditional decision analytic strategies do not apply. People can also draw on some self-correcting characteristics of mental simulation to overcome some of the limitations that were described above. We often have a general sense of whether the simulation is becoming unrealistic. In 1997, Marvin Cohen believes that mental simulation is usually self-correcting through a process he has called snapback. Mental simulation can explain away disconfirming evidence, but Cohen has concluded that it is often wise to explain away mild discrepancies since the evidence might itself not be trustworthy. However, there is a point when we have explained away so much that the mental simulation becomes very complicated. So if you can only poke small holes in your mental simulation, it's not worth discarding the whole thing. And I think that's part of the anti-fragile nature of it. That's where you would just like replace that one part. You don't have to construct the whole, like if you're thinking about it as a computer program, you don't have to construct the whole program and then if you run into one bug, delete all the code and like start over. Usually you can just debug it. That's what it's like there for. It's editable. It's not chiseled in stone, and you don't have to get rid of the whole thing. It's not all one giant like what would you call singular part. It's not like a monad. You can in software, by the way, there's this idea of a singleton. If you're programming, sometimes the best way to program is to make everything one like giant object or like one giant function, which makes it very easy to write, but it's not very maintainable. Also, it's not split up usually very well. It's easy to make like one giant overwhelming thing that does too many things and it becomes unwieldy. And splitting it up eventually becomes impossible. It's like too interconnected. But mental simulations seem to be very small and they're modular. You can just, swap out one part for another. Each step seems to be, it takes less than 3 variables and there's only 6 steps. So, I mean, it seems almost perfect for modularity. So yeah, it seems robust. It seems like what he's talking about, the snapback rule, discarding the worries that some little errors are going to ruin the whole simulation. Just replace them, just debug it. At this point, we begin to lose faith in the mental simulation and re-examine it. We look at all of the new evidence that had been explained away to see if maybe there is not another simulation that makes more sense. Cohen believes that until we have an alternate mental simulation, we will keep patching the original one. We will not be motivated to assemble an alternate simulation until there is too much to be explained away. The strategy makes sense. The problem is that we lose track of how much contrary evidence we have explained away, so the usual alarms do not go off. This has also been called the garden path fallacy. Taking one step that seems very straightforward and then another, and each step makes so much sense that you do not notice how far you are getting from the main road. Excuse me. Cohen is also developing training methods that will help people keep track of their thinking, become more aware of how much contrary evidence they've explained away so they can see when to start looking for alternate explanations or predictions. So here's an example of a snapback. Occasionally, I engage in orienteering. I've never heard of that. Which takes place in nature preserves. I'm given a map with markers at designated points. I need to find these points, punch the card with the special punches located at each to show that I was there, and orient my way around the course. For beginners, the course follows paths in the woods. When you move to a higher level, you are on your own, crossing streams and scrambling up hills. Once, when I was leaving a designated waypoint, I absent-mindedly turned west when I meant to turn east. Soon, none of the terrain features matched my topological map. Nevertheless, I was able to continue for a surprisingly long time. A small creek appeared where none was marked. Must have been new since the map was made. A curving path was supposed to be straight. It was sort of straight for a small section. On I plunged, forcing the terrain to fit my map, reinterpreting the cues I was supposed to be seeing. Eventually, I came to a section that I could not explain away except by turning the map 180 degrees, and that violated north and south unless my compass had also been broken. That was the moment of snapback. The accumulated strain of pushing away inconvenient evidence caught up with me. That sounds like being red-pilled, by the way. It sounds like that's like what Cohen's studying is like how to red pill someone, but it sounds like everyone is just explaining away these inconsistencies all the time in what Andrew Tate would call the Matrix. Like, oh, that's supposed to happen. That glitch in the physics simulation, yeah, that was supposed to happen. Or like in the real world, it's like, yeah, I mean, like, yeah, they're 2% of the population, but like they're just really smart. Like you could just explain it away. You could just figure out some way to discount your own, like, who would you believe, me or your lying eyes? As soon as you start questioning the narrative, it's like someone prods you back onto the path. The map looks correct again, because otherwise you lose social capital or social credit score or whatever it may be in the future. But you can see how like there's a tipping point where someone just like sees something that's so it just renders the whole simulation as fake. None of the other facts can add up. It destroys the simulation. The whole thing needs to change, and they snap back and they realize the whole thing was wrong the whole time. And they probably are kicking themselves for not seeing it and explaining it away. So yeah, it's like that was what came to mind when I was reading that anyways. But okay, so applications. We're finally at the end of the chapter where we figure out how we can apply this to our own lives, our own careers, our own little simulacra. Cohen, Freeman, and Thompson in 1998 had been working on a crystal ball method to help people become sensitive to alternate interpretations of a situation. They asked officers to describe an explanation in which they felt high confidence. Then they pretend to peer into a crystal ball and inform them that their explanation was wrong. The crystal ball does not show why it was wrong. The officers have to sit through the evidence and come up with another explanation, and perhaps another. In doing so, they see that the same evidence can be interpreted in different ways. So that's like if you've ever come up with a plan and someone's just being an asshole, and you're like, all right, guys, I thought of a plan. This is how we're going to do this. And then someone's just like, it's not going to work. And you're like, what? And they're like, it's not going to work. Trust me. And you're like, all right, well, I'll think of another plan. You can immediately like realize, okay, maybe there is another way to do it. But it takes like someone or something to just like tell you it's not going to work. Because usually you're pretty confident in your first plan. Even just someone like being cocky or someone being annoying and just like screwing with you and telling you, no, that's not going to work. Sometimes that's enough for you to like come up with an alternate plan. It's like, why didn't I just come up with that second plan by myself? Why did it take someone prodding me like that? Why did it take someone shaking me essentially and like telling me that simulation wouldn't work? So maybe try doing that with yourself. My coworkers and I use a similar method to help people anticipate what will happen when a plan is put into action. We call it the pre-mortem strategy. The idea comes from some work we did on the amount of confidence people place in a plan they had imagined. We hypothesized that people may feel too confident once they have arrived at a plan, especially if they are not highly experienced. You can ask them to review the plan for flaws, but such an inspection may be half-hearted since the planners really want to believe that the plan lacks flaws. We devised an exercise to take them out of their perspective of defending their plan and shielding themselves from flaws. We tried to give them a perspective where they would be actively searching for flaws in their own plan. This is the pre-mortem exercise, the use of mental simulation to find the flaws in a plan. Our exercise is to ask planners to imagine that it is months into the future and that their plan has been carried out. And it has failed. That is all they know. They have to explain why they think it failed. They have to look for the causes that would make them say, of course, it wasn't going to work because. The idea is that they are breaking the emotional attachment to the plan's success by taking on the challenge of showing their creativity and competence by identifying likely sources of breakdown. It takes less than 10 minutes to get people to imagine the failure and its most likely causes. The discussion that follows can go on for an hour. We've tested this pre-mortem method, and it seems to reduce confidence in the original plan as we expected. We've also come to include it as a part of the kickoff meeting for new projects to help us identify the trouble spots. And I'm pretty sure I watched that Jeff Bezos interview with Lex Friedman. And say what you will about Lex Friedman, you know, we know all about him. But the interview was revealing. It was actually stunning that he was, you know, we think of CEOs of like these big tech companies that are like globalist or like international as like, you know, they're just like robots. They're just figureheads, whatever. Like maybe they're not even in charge. Like so that's like some like conspiracy theories. Like they don't even do anything. They're just like, you know, whatever. But I thought of Bezos as like some weird nerdy guy. No riz. I thought of him as like this dry guy that, you know, he started a book company. Like how exciting could this guy be? How personable could it be? He's definitely not like me. I was like, man, he's got to be nothing like me. But he was actually pretty relatable. I immediately thought of like, wow, this makes Mark Zuckerberg and like some other CEOs like Elon Musk look like freaks. Like Peter Thiel was like, I tripping over his words. He was like some weirdo, like sweating while he was doing his NatCon speech. He probably had months of training for this. Like he's a public facing celebrity in some sense. Like he's probably had some training for public speaking before that. And it was terrible. And Jeff Bezos is like nailing this interview. He's like crushing it. Like you can relate to him. You're like sympathetic to him. And he's the richest man in the world. He's like a billionaire, like a multi-billionaire. He has like yachts the size of cities. You could never imagine his lifestyle. And here he is explaining it to you. And it's like, it's relatable. So anyways, I digress. In the interview with Lex Friedman, he's like breaking down his meeting structure and like how he does these meetings at Amazon, these big corporate meetings that involve a lot of people, and he talks about the pre-mortem. I don't know if he names it. I don't think he calls it the pre-mortem. Maybe he does. I'd have to go back and watch it. But he's talking about how they sit down with this pre-written memo and everybody gets it, and they have to sit in silence and read it for like an hour, and they have to come up with reasons why it'll work and reasons why it'll fail. And they have there's like a session, like a 10-minute session or something. I forget what it was. But the idea of it was that they can all anonymously, I think it's like write something down and present like a way that the plan could fail, or like what don't they like about this this proposal, what could go wrong, and they're doing the pre-mortem. That's literally what that is. And he says it's very effective. Sometimes he gives the document out the night before so people can come up with the pre-mortems. So I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was like a very practical, and you know, it's easy to understand. Everyone's ordered something from Amazon. It's very easy to understand how big of a company that is, and how many executives there are, and how many managers there are, and how abstract and how wide spanning those problems are that they're facing, and how big their plans must be to tackle those problems. So Yeah, it's almost necessary that they seek out tools like the pre-mortem. It's almost necessary that they attack their own plans from every angle, every conceivable angle before they put them into action. So if it works on a large scale, maybe it works on a small scale. Maybe you can try that at home. So start attacking your own plans. Start figuring out why they might fail before they even fail. And you could probably do it in the reverse. You could probably say, why did it succeed? My plan worked. How do I get from point A to point B? I want to lose weight. Okay, I lost 15 pounds. How did I do it? That's like the pre-mortem, but in the positive sense. So maybe that works. I don't know. It seems like it would. All right, I got Goose requesting. And by the way, if anybody else wants to request, feel free to come up here. It's a discussion space. Don't forget, it's not just a book space. I'm not just reading at you guys. But all right, Goose, you can now speak. Feel free to go off, King.
Hey, what's going on, NJ? It reminded me of how really good coaches break down like football. Like I used to pay attention to college football, and I was very interested in how it works. And so in practice, what you would do is like the day before the game, there's no hitting because you wanted to make sure your guys are healthy, but you needed the game plan to make sure it looked good. So in sports, what they would do is they would run through the playbook and they would kind of come up with because you'd be watching film of your opponent and like what works against them, right? Now, say you got the number one running back in the country and he's just a monster. And so we're going to feed this beast. We're just going to go bam, right at him. And then we got to think, wait a second, they got like a great linebacker over there that could match our guy. This guy's like a top linebacker. So what do we do now? We don't really have much else. Yes, we do. We got this, and you got to just start going through all your options. The best guys in the country never have one plan. That's why like this the structure of like point A to point D, B, C matter. Every step you take along the way is a success or a failure, and you have to be prepared for whatever's going to come your way. Like, and that's just sports, but same thing when it comes to life. Yeah, I can see why the structure in these tables like very useful.
Yeah, and Sports Groper would love this. Yeah, I totally agree that like you also do need to be multi-planning, like having multiple plans. Having one plan's good, like one really solid plan's awesome. But like you said, like what if one of your players gets hurt, or like what if the plan doesn't work? You have to have a plan B.
Well,
So,
look at scholastic sports before like scholarships, before steroids, before all of it. Who are the best academies in the country? You know, it was like the military. Those were the guys who were able to execute a plan violently. So if something's not going right, hey, we're gonna do something out here, whether it works or not. You know.
yeah, that's a good point. That's a good connection. I don't think I'm not like super. I'm not a big sports guy. I'll just come out and say
I'll say sports. Don't worry. I'll take the sport.
it. Not a big sports guy, but yeah, you telling me, and this is totally anecdotal, but you telling me that the military teams were the best teams, yeah, that does not surprise me. So yeah, they're probably just very good at setting goals and achieving them. So
NJ.
yeah, what's up, Noam?
So I just want to say that I remember your thinking fast and slow from what was that like 6 months ago?
Yeah, it's been almost a year at this point since I started.
Almost a year. Yeah, no, I wanted to say when I tuned in, like your like reading quality, it was like professional audiobook quality. Like I'm not trying to gas you up for no reason. Like
Yeah,
That's
what
saying
fun.
like
happened? It's gone downhill. This is so bad.
It's gone down. Is that what you're saying, Noam? No,
no, it was really good. Like I was like, is this a recording? Like what the heck? But no, I think it's interesting what you're saying about like steel manning your own plans and that stuff. But like, just to counter signal or counterpoint or whatever is like, they say that like people with like high IQ that are able to think of like tons of different contingencies often get like trapped in just like running over all the contingencies of what could go wrong. And like you look around and like a lot of the most like successful, most like aggressive, like mid-level business people. I'm not talking about the genius Bezos people of the world, but just like the guy that like is like running his used car dealership really hard. It's like the 115 to like 125 IQ people that are not necessarily like crippled by thinking of every contingency that could go wrong. They're just like kind of like going for it. But I so
Yeah, yeah.
um
Yeah, they're able to come up with like a couple good plans and then just like execute them. They're not like crippled by like neuroticism or like is this plan going to work? Let me think of every possibility. And they probably don't even have that capability.
Yeah, what are the chances you thought of the plan of the thing that went wrong? So those guys, like you're saying, those mid-level guys who are just attacking the next step, that's probably the best way to get something done. Yeah, not think of every possibility.
yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is like on the scale of something like Amazon, where like if you steer the ship like 1 degree in the wrong direction, extrapolate that out billions of dollars because these losses are going to be magnified on the scale of a massive corporation. Like that's a big deal. So you got to steel man your plans. But if you're just like a guy with a small business and you're 2% off course, but you're attacking it with everything you got, like you're not even going to notice. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
the margins are so small that it almost doesn't matter. It's totally negligible. You don't have to factor that in. That makes total sense. So yeah, like when the odds are in your favor or like the chance of failure is so small, it's like you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to be steel manning all of your plans and like analyzing how they could all go wrong at every point. Maybe you just do the gut instinct thing where you just like, I like this plan, I don't like this plan. Maybe that's good enough for like the 115 IQ car dealer guy. So yeah, like slinging cars, I don't. You do what works, you know. Maybe you don't need to do the whole investigation into why that one person didn't buy the car. Maybe that's not useful. So yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's just like a scale thing. Like if if our federal government or something, was like trying to figure out how to like efficiently spend money, maybe they would want to use some of these like techniques instead of like just winging it or whatever. But yeah, like the guy that's just like trying to run a coffee shop or a car dealership or like just take whatever kind of small business to the next level. Like sometimes like the overthinking contingencies like hurts more than it helps. But obviously you gotta there's common sense that's gotta come into play there.
Yeah, you could think about like a little coffee shop, like bringing in McKinsey and Associates to like figure out what's going to go wrong. And that's like just imagining that just sounds ridiculous because it's such overkill. But yeah, like some people like overthinking, overanalyzing. That's what that would be like. It would be just as crippling, maybe financially, but certainly like in the process of goal planning. So
Yeah,
yeah,
so
yeah,
like sometimes I'll be watching like just I'm not a big investor, like don't get me wrong, I don't have a bunch of money or anything, but I just intellectually I enjoy watching like how to invest in stocks. Invest is $5,000. You need to invest that into like books and getting smarter. And then like in 5 years from now, you'll have a real amount of money to invest. You know what I'm saying? So
the
like
stack.
it's like you're overthinking something small instead of like working on like the big picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you got to have the bookshelf. Maybe $5,000 worth of like U.S. dollars or crypto is like maybe the value of that is less than the knowledge you could have from reading books. So yeah, I that's also like a planning thing. So yeah, something to consider as well.
No, not books, sports. No.
I just want to jump in here and point
Yeah,
out.
yeah, go ahead.
No, just for Gnome's sake, the book is from a guy who had a consulting practice where he studied teams of experts. So he's not describing like courses of action that normal people can take. He's describing to the cognitive psychology community, what experts have in common. that they don't really understand, right? The book starts with him talking about the difficulties in getting the most experienced firefighters to talk about why they saved a whole team of firefighters, right? They're like, it must have just been an angel, on my shoulder. And then, through some kind of interrogation, he gets them to basically understand that they understood like the floor was flexing in the kitchen, right? So they knew that there was about to be a blowout. And so it's more along those lines. He's trying to actually like dissect what makes people who others just assume are extremely instinctive, but themselves can't articulate why they're the best at what they do. So trying to create, I think, some kind of course of instruction for teams. And it's funny, I don't want to spoil it, but I am going to spoil it a little bit. Goose and NJ Gloiper were talking about military teams or whatever being highly efficient. Later in the book, Klein discusses, he says that the best teams that he investigated or, examined for the government were the wildland forest firefighters. And he chalks that up because they had a lot of practice, not just the guys out there fighting the fire, forest to forest or whatever, dropping retardant out of an airplane or something, but the entire command structure, kind of the entire enterprise as a whole. But he said, yeah, they get a lot of practice. There aren't that many of them. And because of that, they basically work every single regional level forest fire. And so they've all known each other for a career or so. And they work together really well and they have a big budget. And they said the worst were the nuclear emergency teams because they never had any experience. I guess it's kind of a fortunate thing, but they've never had to deal with an actual nuclear power plant crisis. So they have no idea what a real one would look like. And there's not much incentive for them to be performant because they don't understand what the alternative is. So anyway, yeah, it's an interesting book. Also, Klein will say things. I don't know if you picked up on that, NJ Gloiper, about like the teams probably in the military that he consulted for and can't discuss or can't talk about. There's one section in the book
Yeah,
where he
yeah.
says where he gives an aside about redesigning the control interface on the airborne early warning aircraft system. So like airborne radar planes, ones that have the big dish on top of them, right? And a bunch of nerds inside on computer stations. And he says like, oh, we helped, redesign their symbology or something like that. But he said, oh, that's just the ones that we can talk about.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Did he write? I know he probably worked on other books. Is Gary Klein the guy that did the fourth idea, or he's got like the idea of oh my God, you've talked about it so many times. No, that's Keith Stanovich. That's Keith Stanovich. Never mind.
Yeah, this
I just
the Stanovich book, Rationality and the Reflective Mind, is almost entirely about chapter 5, what you just went through in this. It's a deep dive
yeah.
into what he calls, because he gets to name it, the reflective mind, which after his work with Kahneman, he says, no, there's not just two systems, there's three, right? There's a third system of thinking. There's not just like instinctive thinking. I've got my notes here actually. Uh, he has his own names. Autonomous thinking, right, is what he calls type 1 or system 1. Algorithmic thinking is actually thinking instead of reacting. So, there's just reacting, then there's thinking about how to react, and then there's what he calls, his third system, the tri-process model, reflective, and that's the algorithmic mind. And he said, this is one thing all experts or highly intelligent people have in common, so-called executive functions, and they can simulate. So they're not just, thinking about how they'll react. They're thinking about how a series of different reactions to the same quandary you're facing, how they'll play out. And, sometimes that results in taking an action. And sometimes the best action is to never have acted at all and just to observe or something like that. But as Kahneman pointed out in Thinking Fast and Slow, executive processes, higher order cognition, it consumes something like 1/3 of the glucose that of your intake. It's like extremely taxing, leads to an extreme amount of fatigue. There's that side in Kahneman's work where he says after getting test subjects to do mentally exhausting tests, when they would take them to the cafeteria they would make unhealthy food choices for lunch. You know, people
Yeah, yeah.
people that didn't have mentally taxing tests would eat like a salad, and the people that they wiped out, like brought to the point of exhaustion, would get a double cheeseburger. So, yeah, it's something that you definitely have to build up. And Stanovich's Rationality in the Reflective Mind goes into pretty great detail about how to do that and kind of the processes by which it takes place. Getting yourself to the he doesn't prescribe how to do it, but obviously getting to the point where you can conduct like menial tasks while mentally simulating other things, where you can kind of break from reality without dissociating. It is interesting. There's a part in there where he identifies, I have it in the notes here, he identifies the mental illnesses of each type of thinking as examples and says that,
Yeah, I
like,
want to hear those. That's actually really interesting.
I'm trying, I gotta try and remember here. I have so many notes from some of these books. You can tell when it's not a great book when you don't have any notes versus lots of notes.
Yeah,
But just from memory, I remember he said that system one thinkers or system one thinking like mental illnesses are like retardation. Like you can't even react properly, much less at all. And reflective mental illnesses were like schizophrenia or like total dissociation, like multiple personalities, right? You don't even you're imagining things that don't exist. Like so in the tri-process theory, like the three layers or three tiers of, I guess, mental modeled reaction or action that are either external or internal. They have a lot of hallmarks, but Stanovich's Sisyphean task is attempting to come up with a quotient, so an identifiable or testable, quantified number for rationality. RQ is what he calls it. His great task is like coming up with a rationality quotient, and a lot of the cognitive psychologists basically tell him like you're just still dealing with IQ, you're still dealing with intelligence, you're still just, all this talk about executive function, you're just talking about IQ. And he points out early on in that work that it's always associated that while more intelligent people can be outworked by dumber people on tests, that there's never been a negative indication between IQ and rationality tests. So we see this fairly often on social media. Not to be an asshole, but I just saw it the other day with that one Midwestern Marks college wrestler who's trying to clout chase off Groypers, Eddie Liger Smith. And I've been aware of him for a while because he was in with the weird CPI guys. But he's a really hard worker, but he's not very smart. He's not very intelligent. And a lot of IQ guys think there's really nothing you can do about that. Stanovich would tell you there is something you can do about it. You can work really hard. And it's a kind of proxy for intelligence. And at a certain point, that becomes something different than intelligence, and it becomes rationality. So while they're associated, there is enough difference there to be testable, but apparently not yet quantified by some testing regime. So Smith, he'll do the one thing that I've noticed hardworking dumb guys do. Most dumb people or, less intelligent people, they don't think about thinking at all. They don't engage in ideological or intellectual pursuits. They just kind of enjoy life, or, their troubles and concerns aren't really existential or theoretical. They mostly are day-to-day life, quality of life issues, etc. But guys that really work hard, they complain and gloat about how dumb other people think they are. They have all these stories, like, and I saw Smith was posting about that. Back when I was a freshman on the wrestling team, and I took my first class on, sociology, and I started getting really into Marx. All the intellectuals would call me stupid. They'd all laugh about how dumb I was because I couldn't read good. But then he just forced himself to do it, right? And this is one thing that really slots in well with what Noam was talking about, where I came in and said, well, what what Klein in this book is trying to describe is people who don't even care about their process. They don't have one, right? They're just very good at what they do. And the biggest problem Klein and his researchers have is trying to find out what that is by talking to them. So they can maybe, in a kind of Stanovich way, help other people work really hard to get on a similar level or just level up themselves. And it makes sense that a guy who's a skilled, like, I don't know if he was a D1 wrestler, but a college wrestler would have discipline. That's what Kahneman, Stanovich, and Klein all agree on as a kind of necessary property for successful people, is that they're disciplined, right? um, and so he disciplines himself into what Marxists call doing the work, reading. They're ideolo- or they're not just ideological, but they're also theorists. And so the most important part becomes like learning the theory. I talked about medical education is all about memorization, memorizing entire trees of responses to diagnoses, right? So if you have an extremely fully active theoretical universe under the penumbra of Marxism, you can just refer to texts. And rote memorization is therefore a much lower IQ or intelligence trait than rationality, which are two totally different things. So it was interesting to see him say, "Look at me now! Like I can make big videos at length." But where he falls apart is when he writes, and that's where I saw Kantbot making fun of him. Kantbot is kind of broken with Logo over Logo getting in bed with these goofy, weird, like they're basically the MAGA communists. And Smith wrote some essay, and it literally it literally looked like it was written by an eighth grader, right? So this is a guy who has good grasp of Marxist theory, um, but where the rubber meets the road, there are holes. And so Countbot is like lampooning it on the timeline. My name Eddie Smith. I think big things online. I read big old books. I want to help people, just lampooning him and making fun of him. And Ryan Dawson's another great example of somebody who's probably could be like a 98 IQ, right? He's just a shade under the white average, but he
Dude.
works really hard and he memorizes
Yeah.
things. He memorizes things. And he does it by creating kind of elaborate graphs and charts, and he sells them too, right? He sells the t-shirt that has, the list of people that went on Epstein's private jet. And he has these stand-ins for what otherwise, if he was a 145 or a 130, he could just do in his mind with his mouth shut, and he never have to reveal the method. So that seems to be like the distinguishing factor. You have to take all these works together, and you got to fill in a lot of blanks of your own, right? You have to engage in the rational process. I'm looking at my notes. I started thinking fast and slow. You want to talk about discipline. I started thinking fast and slow. I got to keep going back. I have so many pages of notes for some of these books. Looks like right around New Year's 2022. Uh, yeah, I started it on January 3rd, 2022, and I read Thinking Fast and Slow: Sources of Power and Rationality in the Reflective Mind. I finished that one. My last note for that one is the 17th. So I read all three of those books, and I wrote probably 50 pages of handwritten notes in 2 weeks. So to me, they stick together really well, right? It's like one long, unbroken 2 week period where I had nothing to do. I was just chilling. I was, for the most part, I was like completely alone. It was like this nice extended holiday break. I built up a whole syllabus of books about this stuff a month or more ahead of time. And I think I read 17 books in, 40 days or something like that. I might have sent you, NJ Gloiper, a screenshot, right, of the reading list with some of them blocked out or erased.
Yeah, yeah.
So the real power in all of this is if you're capable, and you won't know until you try, of attaining these techniques, you can kind of take the training wheels off if they work, and they become a part of what you do. within a year of reading all this stuff, I moved on to the point where I was thinking out loud all the time. And I was rehearsing. I got that from Barsky. Remember Book Cat watched that guy's interview, Jack Barsky, the weird
Oh yeah.
Soviet
Oh
spy.
yeah.
In his book, he said, one of the things that KGB trained him on was rehearse like every move you're going to make for 2 weeks ahead of time. And so he'd go into a public park at night in New York City at like 2 a.m. and he'd just walk around in an uninhabited area rehearsing a phone call he would make to try and get a fake ID, or something like that.
Dude, that's so real. That's so real. I'm learning Spanish right now, and I just found like a really good resource for learning the language. And one of the things was like become the narrator of your own life in the language that you're
Yeah,
learning,
and you only have to
and that's
do
how
that
you learn it.
once, though. You only have to do that for a phase if you succeed. You only have had to do that for like the 3 grueling months that it took to attain that.
Yeah.
And then without realizing it, the further along you get, the less you'll remember that you don't have to do that anymore to continue to ride the bike without the training wheels. So about a year after I read all these books, I was finally to the point where I wasn't necessarily rehearsing, but I would cognate out loud. And I was doing that to try and build a much richer internal monologue than I usually had, where it's kind of difficult maybe to identify the qualities of your internal monologue. Does it sound exactly like you sound? And so once I could get to the point where I could hear myself talking, almost acting. I don't know if you remember in the Discord back then, New Year's 23, around then, um, I was talking about reading into different acting techniques. Like,
Yeah, the Meisner technique and stuff like
yeah, the
that.
Meissner technique, which is crazy. The impact that stuff has on how people think they demonstrate that by how they speak. That's the one where they just say the same lines back and forth in different
Yeah, yeah.
inflections, and all of a sudden it sounds like you can act, which is crazy, right? That's all it takes, which shows you just how much work real actors actually have to do to be able to do that cold and unconsciously all the time, which is what Klein would say is a hidden source of expert power, is that experts do that without ever being able to articulate that they're doing that, without ever having to be trained on that. So the good news is, and Stanovich is a major proponent and always has been of this. He was the guy who developed the so-called Matthew effects in the 1990s into the study that reading, especially highest kind of cognition load material, makes you smarter and TV makes you dumber. The Matthew effects research is pretty wild. And so Stanovich has always been on this, like, your brain plasticity extends your entire life to varying degrees. You can outwork other people. Whether or not you need some kind of chip on your shoulder depends on you. But what he doesn't get at, because it's so often the case that researchers don't participate in their own work, which is almost self-defeating and crazy in a way. I read Frances Yates' Art of Memory, where she surveys the ancient techniques of mnemology, like memory enhancement. And she says, yeah, I never tried any of this stuff. She just assembles it and writes about it. And so, in an interesting way, like, the onus is now on you. Like, you have to try this stuff to understand its worth or value, and it will completely fade away out of your mind, but it will have left enough of the practice, and that if you, like most normal people, you're going to engage in higher order thinking if you're interested in it. That it kind of just shapes your actions. You become a much more reflective practitioner because you don't have to reveal anything about what you're actually doing. You're just doing things. And I'm not saying like this is how you become mysterious, right? You read Gary Klein's Sources of Power like a checklist, and you learn how to you take acting classes and you learn how to internalize that whole process that you're hearing out loud alone. And then no one knows you have your rich inner monologue around every pre-mortem or whatever. No one knows that you're chugging grape juice to get your glucose up right before 30 minutes before you have to do some exhaustive reality rejecting simulation over how you're gonna, the 16 different plans I have for dealing with my father-in-law, right? While I'm on the cruise, every time I go into the dining room at the cruise for at least 1 hour. It'll be, if he goes A, I'll have to go B, right? Whatever it is, eventually that stuff fades into the background and it just starts to be a behavior that only some other person can observe. And all of a sudden you're the expert and Gary Klein is there with the timer and the stopwatch and the clipboard, right? Writing down. So what did you say you did here? You know? And that is what I've heard referred to as unconscious competence. So I guess I would just say this, the only way you can deal with or hang with the experts is to just work as hard as possible. And experts will tell you that too. I watched a documentary about some guy who was just dominating bull riding, professional bull riding. I don't have an interest in that, but great people are interesting. And this guy, probably 10 years ago, had won like 7 titles in a row. And the setup of the documentary is hilarious. They go around and interview all the other guys that would be champions, except for this guy is the champion. So all the, number twos, number threes, or whatever. And they have all these excuses about why this guy's the champion. They're like, oh, his legs are just longer than a normal man's legs or whatever. Have you seen how his thighs look? Like he could just clamp that bull in a genetic fashion that I'll never be able to obtain. And then they cut to this dude and he goes, they're not here, right? He's at his ranch and he just says, they're not here. And it shows him standing in the kitchen eating a snack. And he's standing on one of those rubber like kickballs in cowboy boots. He's standing on it. He's standing on it. He's not like wobbling around or anything. He's standing. He's totally balanced on it on both feet. And then they talk to his parents, and his dad's like, oh, when he was 2 or 3, we put one of these, I don't know what it's called, some bull riding simulator that's like, kinetically self-powered. Oh, we hung it from a tree out there. It's like a seesaw looking thing of like a little fake bull thing. It's like a training apparatus for children to become bull riders. And he goes, he just spent like all day for the rest of his childhood on that. Like sun up to sundown, I would see my son out there on that thing, like on the training apparatus. So that another part of it, you get to choose how much to reveal. And when you remember that you need to be saving your energy, your mental energy for high order cognition, for mental simulations, you won't even waste your time on bringing someone to a speed that they can't get up to. You just do the Joker thing, right? You wouldn't get it. You don't even have to say you wouldn't get it. That's actually a reflective practice, isn't it? Not saying you wouldn't get it, not thinking, not stopping yourself from saying you wouldn't get it, thinking about how you should say it and be like, well, look, it would take a while to explain, right? That would be system 2 thinking. You wouldn't get it. System 1 thinking, taking a while to soften the blow is system 2 thinking, but system 3 or reflective thinking would just be not putting yourself in a position where you have to deal with people who ask you questions like that. Have you ever wondered why politicians have cutouts? Why they have press secretaries and body men, and you can't even get to these people. You couldn't get them on the phone unless you paid you probably couldn't get them on the phone even after you paid $100,000 to shake their hand at a campaign event. That's how you get to talk to them. You have your 90 seconds to talk to them behind the curtain because you paid them $100,000. And that's because if you are worthy of other people's attention, you can reach that level. But maybe like the Scientologists taught, if somebody is powerful or sufficiently powerful enough versus somebody who is not, they can literally kill them, maybe metaphorically. But like there's, that's what they said about the OT3 or whatever, where revealing the knowledge of how humans came to existence through Xenu or all this other goofy stuff. They said, oh, you can't tell this to anybody who hasn't been through the pipeline. It'll kill them. And that is kind of true in a way. You can't just take somebody on like a con artist or a political operative or whatever. That's the same thing. They can just go generate money and angst and pain for people out of thin air because there's something about them that maybe Gary Klein would want to turn into a teachable process. And Stanovich would tell you, if you work really hard at these identifiable processes, you could outmaneuver or outwork, or you could be less susceptible to them. But why waste your energy when you know the value of it? Because the discipline means you don't use it, picking between different salad leaves at Trader Joe's or leaving decisions, you delegate or leave decisions to other people that you don't care about. So, anyway, I'm just saying, like, once you get into the practice of using mental energy for things that you couldn't do 18 months before, there are things I don't necessarily directly attribute to learning this stuff, but to putting it into practice that I could never do until a certain point in my life. And then I couldn't do, and then I was thrilled to see that I did something on an 18-month timeline. 18 months sounds like crazy now to me. And there are things now that maybe the last time I thought about how long it took me to execute that stuff, it was a matter of like hours, and I don't think about it anymore, and I'm sure I'm still doing it. Eventually, the trophy case is packed, right? You don't care after like the third or fourth time that you nail something, and you don't even talk about what you did or what you're doing anymore. And it's not even part of your mystique. You're just that guy who gets the call or whatever, right? So, I guess that's one way of looking at it. If you put all three of these guys together, one just puts together a compendium of the quirks of human cognition and Kahneman. The second, Klein, really directly goes and talks about finding people who were less susceptible to these natural things, even though they couldn't really articulate it. He tries to, not even on their behalf. And then Stanovich is like, here's how deep the most important cognitive aspects of this process are, the fundamental process of being able to do all this stuff inside your mind. And the good news is you can just do it. It's a point that suffuses rationality in the reflective mind. Lots of dumb people who even do this. It's worth like one standard deviation on an IQ test, hard work, versus rationality. So, anyway, that's way more stuff than I intended to say coming in here, other than if you liked chapter 5, Stanovich's reality or rationality in the reflective mind is probably about 2/3 of the book is this stuff.
That's perfect. I got the next book on deck then, because I'm not going to read the economic stuff. I'll read that like with you guys on the book streams. I know you're busy, Wendell, so I'm not like shitting on you. That's not like a diss. I know you're busy with that, but the Alexander Hamilton stuff and the America's Protectionist Takeoff, that like I love reading that with you guys, but I can't do that at my own speed. I'm just like I don't have the context. I'm not an expert. So I like doing this stuff. The philosophy and the modes of thinking is way cooler to me.
Look, I saw there was an 18 marathon on TV the other day, the TV show from the 80s. Everybody on the A team does a different thing, right? You don't need to be super cross functional. Actually, the test for cross functionality comes from, like you said, just from time to time enjoying the content that other people, on the team make. But you don't need to go in there and try to one up them.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
Yeah, there are things you're going to
I
be.
probably couldn't.
There are things you're interested in that nobody else is, and that's actually how they become a little bit interested, or at least conversant or fluent in it, is from somebody else around them who's also interested in it. Stanovich gets a lot more into I guess what we call the feedback loop of cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence research. So that's always been locked together. James Gleek's the information gets at that at a broader scale once he reaches the 1950s. So yeah, there are a lot of direct applications for this stuff. When I started reading this syllabus, Bookcat was like, "Isn't that the stuff that all the NRX guys were into a decade ago?" And I went and looked. Yes. So this is actually where all the modern AI millennial camps come from, is they were obsessed with this stuff. They integrated it into a field of thought that they called rationalism. These are the people that all went on to found OpenAI and are basically the kind of guiding lights of the modern large language model revolution. They've broken up along a bunch of different lines, but if you go back to Less is Wrong, the website where this kind of all took root, you'll go and find the reviews of these same books from like 2008. So it's it's not like some model to become a weird libertarian, techno libertarian nerd or something. It can inform how these people generally think, but also it's universal enough that Gary Klein is talking about firefighters and, uh, Air Force nerds and police officers or whatever. It's the one thing we all have in common is that we cognate. So it's people will wash their hands of books because somebody they don't like enjoys them, but they're forgetting to separate facts from values.
Let's go. Yeah, yeah. The yeah, I really have started to learn to separate the art from the artist. I really learned to appreciate a work, for what it is. Someone did think about it, sit down and do the work, so you can appreciate it in that sense, even if you don't agree with it. And sometimes it gives you a window into their thinking that you would never have otherwise. So yeah, shying away from people's work is just goofy, I think.
James Baker, Secretary of State, said, it's easy to talk to your friends. It's hard to talk to your enemies, right? But it's more important. So diplomacy is important because it's almost totally reflective. There's all kinds of things not being said that are being thought. And, what is being said is at its best, only capable of being mined for inference. There's some things I have to deal with where I'll take more than a week to try and understand like a single 1 minute conversation I had with another person. And that's actually where I use premortems all the time. Is I have time and I'm like, what did that mean? Like, what do they mean by this? You don't want to burn political capital by reaching back to them and hey, can you go back over what you meant or whatever, blah, blah, blah. It would ruin it. It would destroy it. You don't want to spend that. So you have to sit there and think over and over and over again, like, what did they mean by this? A lot of times people communicate very cryptically. And so you have to think constantly. And your first reactions are useful, but in the way that Bayes' theorem would prescribe. So Bayesianism is pretty important attachment to like system one, system two thinking. And that Bayes says, you have your instincts and your gut feelings when you encounter things, and those are important. Now set them aside and gather as much evidence as you can, right? And then weigh that with your feelings and your instincts and kind of find the appropriate weighting to come up with a synthetic response or the answer being, composed of both of those things. So, but what does this shit all have in common? That it's hard. And the more tired you are, even if you're hungry, it becomes impossible. So, the discipline to wait until you're riding on a full tank is also incumbent. And in many cases, the longer you wait, the more something tides over and actually reveals itself to have been about something else, right? And not somebody griping at you, hey, what are you going to do about the this, that, or the other? And you're like, what did he mean by this? And then you're like, man, I'm so tired. I just got off a flight. I haven't even eaten. There's no way I'm going to respond to this guy until like tomorrow after lunch, maybe after a nap after lunch. And then by the time you check back in, you're preparing to respond. You're like, oh, all this other stuff happened. This guy probably just wanted to, make a distraction from whatever this other thing going down was, right? And then you learn, you kind of put that in the toolbox. You're like, okay, in poker, that would be a tell. So the next time a person like that does the thing, you get to A/B test. You get to change your response or you get to be proactive. And when they're starting to exhibit signs of having their tail emerge, like, oh, they're, something's up, they're doing this one thing. What happened last time when I didn't do anything versus what if I get ahead of this? What'll happen if I get ahead of this and how? So, but then like that's super exhausting. That's what most people would associate with politics, like office politics, this idea that yes, we have to treat every single person very differently. Like that's where individualism rules, is where people have radically different sensibilities and responses to the same approach. And once you start being able to manage that and integrate that with your Dunbar number, right? That we, Dunbar said you can know like 200 people. You can keep track of like 200 people. Keep your mental Rolodex. I would encourage all of you to go and look at David Rockefeller's Rolodex. It's the stuff of legend. David Rockefeller did not entrust his own memory to keeping tabs on all of the powerful and important people he dealt with. So he had his secretary keep for like his whole lifetime as an adult updated Rolodex cards. And over time, it's like a compendium of all the information over years that he dealt with these people. And you'd see like older entries crossed out on a typewriter and they'd be dated, for decades. Okay, don't give him shellfish, or whatever. Remember, he's on his third wife now, and this is her name. Don't mention the first two, right? Like he'd have all these little things, ostensibly. So when the people running his schedule were like, "Hey, you're going to talk to this guy," he'd be like, "Give me the card," like what's the latest on this Saudi banker or something. So this is a great way to not waste time. There's another book. I didn't like it as much because it just wasn't very useful to me, but it's probably very good, by Csikszentmihalyi, Finding Flow. Don't, I mean, the guy's last name is spelled Csikszentmihalyi. Okay. But Finding Flow, and he talks about, in this one, it's about the flow states. It's kind of like the hippie version of Klein's sources of power. Like, what do successful people have in common? I read another book by Erickson, I think it was called Peak, and it's almost like how do successful people spend their time preparing? That's what Peak was about. But Finding Flow is all about the kind of mental state that successful people are in while succeeding. And one thing I had in a giant red box in my notes: never waste time. And so the more you're preoccupying yourself with thinking about, like, okay, like next week I got to go to St. Louis and I got to deal with the whole manufacturing division on the plant floor. And like, what was that foreman's name? I hope he's still not there. Okay, but what if he's still there? And you're just doing this over and over in your mind. That doesn't mean you can't sit and watch TV at the same time. What that means is if you can do that while sitting and watching TV at the same time, you are now, Mr. Executive Process, or whatever, the System 3 mastermind. You're a reflective thinking mastermind. I uh
It's Stanovichian.
I went to the second Avatar movie, and I could tell it was not going to be very good. It was entirely visual, right? It was in 3D, IMAX, etc. And pretty quickly I was like, I knew the storyline was going to suck because they just re-released Avatar 1 in September. And I was watching this around New Year's whenever it hit theaters, the second one. And I had a bunch of stuff I needed to do, and I didn't want to not go to the movie with everybody else. And so I just sat there and I just went through a bunch of mental simulation while still enjoying the insane ultra high definition laser IMAX 3D Dolby whatever experience. And that was one of my greatest tests. And now I actually have a positive memory of Avatar 2, even though I couldn't tell you anything about the plot. Just tell you, like, wow, the visuals were sick. Like, it was like the first one, but in water, and like the graphics were like 10 times cleaner. It was crazy. The 3D was way better. And they're like, well, if you didn't like it, like, why do you have such a positive feeling toward it? And I just like, well, I I had like 2 hours in an extremely demanding environment to just simulate a bunch of stuff I had to execute later that week. And I went and did it, and it worked brilliantly. Like over the next like 8 or 9 months, the behaviors and actions that I simulated, and like the pre-mortems that I worked through during the insane front row 3D experience, they worked beautifully. Not in ways that I intended, because you're not sure. You don't know how that's going to work itself out, but it did succeed, and that the problem almost completely eventually solved itself, right? And it's tied to my actions, but that it's not very beneficial to say like, oh, that's because I did this. It's actually better in many cases for something to succeed with the least amount of your personal input. And then success doesn't need to have one more father, right? Especially if you're in a position under leadership somewhere, they deserve all the credit, even if they didn't do anything. That's loyalty. That's how successful organizations work. And if you're not there, going like, oh yeah, well, actually it was me and I did the minimum amount of input. That's how good I am. All I had to do was just correct the trajectory with a slight tap. But while it would look like a slight tap to you, it actually took 200 hours of excruciating mental exhaustion over the 6 months before and all my spare time. Every time I was in the shower, I was thinking about how am I going to handle this problem when the circumstance arises. No one wants to hear that. It doesn't even sound good to pretend to talk about. So don't. And eventually you won't feel like saying anything about what you're doing. And maybe other people won't know you're actually doing things. And if you're right and your tiny little inputs are making things better, then everybody's going to enjoy things being slightly better. But it doesn't, none of this stuff has anything to do with your ego. It's probably self-terminating if you use it for aggrandizement. I talked about Eddie Smith's essay. If he had never, or I mean, his little like,
Yeah.
his tweets about like everybody thought I was dumb. If he'd never written that, almost none of his followers, actually, none of that guy's followers think he's dumb. What percentage of them now wonder how dumb he is because he talked about people think I'm dumb? So it's hard. And remember, the more exhausted you are, the less disciplined you are. So maybe when you're being undisciplined, you're actually exhausted. So choose not to act in those periods. Conserve your energy for beneficial things. Otherwise, you're actually going to have to watch all of Avatar 2.
Did you like the movie?
Dude, the graphics were insane. I don't know what happened to NJ Gloiper. I think he's taking a nap. I put him to sleep.
That was a good mic drop, I'll say that.
Yeah, it just falls on its face when the host doesn't pick it up,
Kind of leaves like that crater, like
Dead
damn.
air.
You're like,
Yeah,
damn.
yeah. It's terrible. He's completely derelict in his duties. He's also revealing himself to not have been paying attention to the monologue either.
Well, I for one was multitasking, doing some work and listening to that, and then simultaneously running through scenarios where I would run through scenarios like Wendell. I'm like scenarioing when I'm going to run through scenarios, even though I'm not going to be in a movie theater.
Yeah, even that works though, because when you say that just now, it gets me thinking about it too. It's like that actually is pretty good use of your
Well,
tired time.
NJ
When
just
you're like,
messaged me. He totally crashed